Welcome to Chop Shop Motors. My name is Clay, and I'd love to take you on a part two to putting together a 289 Ford small block that really is, it's not a total refresh. It's more like figuring out where the motor was at when I bought it and what was the complaint, and seeing if I could take a whole bunch of pieces that I had and turn it into a usable motor, and not necessarily a brand fresh board and you know, everything being new. We're replacing what needs to be replaced, or taking a look at some of the parts and using what we can, and kind of doing a little bit of an autopsy on what maybe was one of the problems or some of the problems with the motor, and really trying to take a pile that no one would be able to discern if it was any good, and making it into something that I can put into a project that is usable, that's a known quantity, and it's kind of a combo house cleaning, shop cleaning, and making things, bring a little order to the chaos in the hot rod shop. So I'll show you the last video. We took it apart, we did some inspection, if you will, of kind of what was the status of that motor and what were the potential problems. And I'll show you what we landed on moving forward. And hopefully I'm going to have some time today to put some of it together and start to make some progress. The goal is to do this quick and you know, painlessly, and not incur a huge amount of costs. I don't need this motor right this minute for any given project, so it's not really high on my list to spend a couple grand build a motor for a project I don't have. But it looks like, from what I can tell in my direction, I'm going to be into this motor for a couple hundred. And for a couple hundred in replacement parts, that's pretty decent to have a known quantity under the bench. So let's take a look at kind of where I've left off prior to this video, and kind of the starting point. So here is the 289 block after a good bath, a cleaning, and a hone of the cylinders. The motor is 60 over, and it has what look to be 10-to-1 pistons. So the pistons and the rods look fantastic. The block cleaned up nice, and you know, this has been sitting in a garage for probably 40 years. So it's not like it's had every year of its life since it was made being used, but it obviously went through an iteration where they went 60 over, which is a lot for one of these motors. But we're going to try it. We're going to run it. Gamble risk is low. I've got some time in it, and we're going to turn, hopefully, we're going to turn this motor into another one of those for a lot less money than I spent on that one. So if you followed along the last video, the heads looked kind of rough. So they had a combination of, they were both 66 289 heads, but there were two versions, and these are the two different versions. So it's got some screw-in studs and some press-in studs. It's got some guide plates and some non-guide plates. And I didn't have a lot of faith in those heads. I mean, they're great if you start at zero and just go back, put guide plates and everything, put screw-in studs and everything. The screw-in studs aren't even the same. I don't know if there's a lot of unknowns with those heads. So, I mean, they're good. They're coarse to start with. The crank is super nice. That's right there, 1010. So that's the starting point. Let me show you some of the goodies I bought for it. What I'm using out of inventory is a set of cam bearings that I had, a set of TRW cam bearings. I had most of a gasket set, but I did not have head gaskets, so I bought a set of Velcro head gaskets, which are what I would want to use on this particular motor. And some of that is because of what I'll show you with the heads I'm going to use. A set of Michigan bearings, 10 under. A set of Federal Mogul rod bearings, 10 under. Both of these are made in USA, new old stock. I just looked for the best value when I bought those, and I wanted made in USA parts. If I could, I just have had better luck with them. I don't want to deal with someone else's subpar quality, and not on this stuff I built. It's just not what I want to do. A couple breathers for the aluminum valve covers I'm going to use. So all good quality rebuild parts, but not a ton of them. I'm not replacing. I'm going to check the end gap on the rings. I'm not planning to put rings in it. Pistons look excellent. There was zero taper on the cylinders, no ridge at all. So there's really no reason to think that that the rings aren't going to be just fine. The reason I'm replacing the bearings is, you know, I build mostly Ford stuff, some small lot Chevy, but a lot of Ford stuff. And you know, even if you just take a used motor and put it in something, it is a really good habit to spin a set of rod bearings into it on Ford stuff. And because of that, if I pull it apart, I don't think I've ever used a set of used bearings, rod bearings especially, in a Ford motor. If I've gotten that close, that far into it, it's time to put bearings in it. These were starting to touch the copper a little bit, and you know, for me, they need the oil pressure. I want the oil pressure. I want the motor, if I'm going to go through this, I want it to have the best chance to be what I'm hoping it's going to be when it's done. So I put bearings in it. So that is the explanation for why I didn't use any of the old bearings over. I apologize, the shop's a bit chaotic. I've got a couple different things going on at the same time, and I'll stop and do a good clean out, but right now I wanted to get this captured before I moved past it today. For the heads, what we're looking at are a set of 351 Windsor heads. So I have used these. This particular set came off of a motor I built a long time ago and ran its life out of it, and it ended up breaking a piston, and I took the short block and I built the motor that's what motor did I build? Oh, I built the motor that you just saw, the blue one, were all the internals and a new block. So, well, a new to me block, replacement block. So I had these heads, 351 heads, and I'd had them on this motor that I built that was a 10-to-1 motor. And what happens when you use the 351 heads is it reduces the compression ratio a little bit. And so I decided to use these heads on this 289 that has 10-to-1s to bring the compression ratio down to something just a little bit more streetable. And it was a great way to use these heads that I didn't have a use for. They were in inventory, and that's kind of the story behind them. So I had the push rods and the head bolts, and they use a different, you have to use a washer on the head bolt because the holes in the heads are a little bit bigger because the 351 uses a different size head bolt. And all that stuff, sort of that changeover, if you will, I had in stock. I kept all that when I tore the motor apart. So that's going to make this a really easy known quantity to put on there. And I used, when I did this before, I used Velcro head gaskets, and so I'm using those again. So that's kind of the scoop here. And then for the intake, I'm using this Offenhauser intake that looks 200 times better than it did before my cleaning extravaganza that I went through on it. This one I got for $10 at a junkyard. So I threw it in inventory because someday I might use it, and today is the Sunday. So I'm going to do a little more work on it, and that's going to work great. So now let me get to work putting some stuff together, and I'll bring you back after I make a little bit of progress. So this step right here is removing the cam bearings because I want to knock in some new cam bearings. So I thought I would take you along and just let you see at least part of the process of removing them. Flip that screen around there. Of removing them and kind of getting ready and knocking in some new ones. So a lot of people take this to a machine shop and do it, but the process is, this is exactly what they're going to do. So I'm just using my Snap-on cam tool. There's a few different kinds of cam tools that get used for this. This one's the one that I use, and it works really well. Some of them are not adjustable. Some of them have a different kind of bushing on the end, but this is the one I have. So I'm on a wheelie cart, so I'm going to have to chase it around a little bit. Might be able to lock it down. There we go. Yep, still in view. I don't know. Okay, so you want to make sure and use the centering cone when you put them back in, but knocking them apart isn't a big deal. So I loosen it up a little bit. I pull my cutter pin puller out and take a look at the cam bearing. So come around and show you kind of what we have here. See if it'll show it on there enough. I'm not sure I'm going to get enough light to get on there. It might. Sometimes what's on the camera isn't actually what you see. So there's the cam bearing. It's a bit worn here at what was the top. So that was my concern. So we're going to spin, well, we won't spin and we'll smack in some new ones. I'll knock a couple out, then I'll get these done, and then I'll bring you back. So again, slide it in there. There's a hole in the end of the tool, the big bolt on the end, and I just use my cotter pin tool to hold the end. And on this one, I can use the centering tool, and I'll see if I can get anything to lock down. No, not too well. My Jugs Handy Gandy cart doesn't work all well. Okay, that one's out, and each cam bearing only fits in one place. Each one is a little different size. So you putting them back in, you have to do it in the right order. Okay. Okay, a little bit worn. All right, I'm gonna finish knocking these out, and then I'll bring you back. Next step is we're gonna knock in the end cam bearing here. So as I said, cam bearings only go in a particular order, and they only go in one way, meaning it has to sit on the tool a certain way, and I'll show you what I mean. It's a really small detail, but it's a detail nonetheless. So the cam bearing is installed on the tool down there. The hole in the bearing is lined up with the gallery hole so that I can check to make sure it aligns and it's going to get oil. I will check that multiple times, as I'm putting in this bearing, especially on this end one, because the bearing has a much larger area that it could go in if you're not paying attention. You just want it to be lined up with that hole. So let's knock that one in. So here is the bearing, and I'm going to see if I can show you what I mean about the edge. So if you look at the edge, I hope this focuses well enough. I'm trying to shine a little light. If you look at the edge, this edge right here, right along here, is a knife edge, really sharp. The edge on the back side has just a little bit of a shoulder, and I mean very little. Like, you can just tell that it has a shoulder versus being all the way to the knife edge. The side with the shoulder on it, very small shoulder, but there is some, is the side that goes up against the tool. No matter which way, if you're putting it into the motor this way, the tool goes on this side. If it's going the other way, the tool still stays on the same side of the bearing and it goes in that way. So all the cam bearings are in, and the cam bearing hole lines up with the gallery hole that comes off of the main. The one thing that you want to make sure of, and I mean, none of this stuff is a tutorial on how to how to freshen up a backyard motor or any of that. It's just how I'm doing it, so take it for what it's worth. The one thing you do want to do when you put in cam bearings, there's always at least one that has two holes in it. So you want to make sure, naturally, it's in the right spot, but you want to make sure that the second hole lines up with what the engineer designed it to line up with. So it's easy to get caught up in the moment of having the one that lines up with the main gallery be in the right place. But don't forget, there's usually a second one. On this motor, on the front bearing, the second one lines up with a small passage that lubricates the distributor shaft. So very critical component in keeping your motor alive. So just double check to make sure you got all the bearings lined up with all the holes that need to happen. So valves are clean and ground, ready to go back in. Stems look good. Expansion plugs got here for the heads. Timing chain got here. I had new gear, top and bottom, but I didn't have a chain. Thought I did, so I ordered that up. That scruffy, nasty old intake manifold is cleaned up. Looks like it's gonna make the cut. I also did a little bit of work just to make sure the ports were in good shape, right where the water jacket hits the head. That's kind of the weak or the trouble area on these small block Ford intake manifolds, aluminum ones. The housing for the thermostat is done. We'll go over here. Cylinder heads are cleaned up and ready to face the seats. Put some expansion plugs in the heads and put these bad boys back together. Over here, parts are clean, main caps are clean, oil pumps out of inventory. I did pull it apart and just give it a kind of once over and lube it up and do a pre-lube on it so that when I put it together it'll pick up a prime really quick. Over here we have push rods are ready to go, pickups clean, all the head bolts and miscellaneous bolts. I'll have to dig up some other bolts out of the parts inventory pile, but for the most part they're ready to go. We've got a set of plug wires for it. Rocker arms I did replace. 4 of the rocker arms were a little didn't quite make the cut, so I got 4 new ones, new old stock ones coming. And I guess that's pretty much everything here, and everything else I think I've shown you so far. The block has the expansion plugs, camshafts in, plugs in the back for the cam, and it's on the engine stem. So I think for right now, I think we're set to go to do the next phase. I think this morning I'm gonna go ahead and build some heads. Heads are done. These are the 351 Windsor heads. Expansion plugs are knocked in. Valves are ground. Pans cleaned up and painted. Everything here is really ready to bolt on, so it's ready for a short block. That's going to be the next step, is get the crank cleaned up, get the pistons and rods cleaned up, and slide that part together. I don't typically paint the parts separate. I usually build the whole motor and then paint it. But sometimes I just thought I'd try it this way and see if the end product turns out just a little bit better. I'll still have to come in, touch up the head bolts and pan bolts and stuff, but there's a chance that this might end up looking just a touch nicer, and we always want our stuff to look nice, so we'll try it this way and see how it goes. Crankshaft's in. As a reminder, this was a 1010 crank, so we got some Newell stock Michigan 10 under main bearings and slid the crankshaft in. The next thing I'm going to do while I'm here is put the timing chain and gear on, get that piece buttoned up, and then we'll put the front cover on. So mains are torqued, her main seal's in, everything's good to go, and I think we're ready to put the chain on and get another piece done. So I'm going to put the chain on, front cover. Well, we've reached a point where we're going to bring part 2 of the 289 Freshen Up to a close, and the reason is we hit a little hiccup. I'll tell you what the hiccup was and what our solution is, but it's going to take, I don't know, a week or two for that to get done. So here's what happened. This motor, 60 over 11-to-1 piston motor, that's a lot of compression, and it had stock 289 heads on it, so that's a lot of compression to try to run on anything but racing gas. But if you take that 11-to-1 piston and put it with a 351 Windsor head that has a much larger chamber, all of a sudden the compression ratio drops down to probably 9 or 9.5 to 1, becomes very streetable, and you get a much larger valve and intake and exhaust, and so you have a really nice solution to get better breathing on the little 289. So my inventory, I had some 351 Windsor heads, so I cleaned those up, built those for this project, and like often happens, it looks like the planets are going to align to take some miscellaneous inventory off the shelves and put them into a motor that becomes a usable bullet under the bench if we find another project or something of that nature. It's much easier to figure out what to do with a done, ready to go engine than it is a whole pile of parts. So that was the plan. We were so close to final execution. So front cover's on, motor's all cleaned up, everything's in. I put a water pump on it, and I was just giving it a once over on the rods and pistons, getting everything ready to prep and slide in the motor. And I noticed something. So what I noticed was a crack. And the crack was actually a piece of the piston. Once I took everything apart, the piston land was broken on one of the pistons. So, as I said in the earlier video, I like to pull them apart. I like to find the smoking gun. This was probably the smoking gun on how I ended up with this motor. And so we found it. So that's the good thing. We found it. The bad thing is like I mentioned, I probably had this motor under the bench for 35 years. And so that's 35 years it hasn't been being misused and abused, but it's also 35 years that they haven't, you might not be able to get that part, and that's exactly what has occurred. So this is a Badger piston. Badger is a company, and we have a part number, it's a P126, which is awesome, but there's nobody that stocks a right side P126 piston, and if I find one, it would be by luck, and so it turns into a little bit of a witch hunt to find a piston. And current pistons, I could put a set of new pistons in it that are late model, like performance 11-to-1 pistons. They probably cost in the neighborhood of $800 to $900, kind of depending on what brand and things of that nature. But that wasn't the goal for this motor. So the goal was to take a whole bunch of parts and make it a usable, functional motor, and not, I don't even have a project for it. So it's hard to justify spending $1,000 plus on a motor that I don't have a project for, versus spending a couple hundred on a project and a motor that's going to go into inventory, which I'm happy with, right? I'm happy to do that. So the directions changed. I ordered a set of basically flat top 289 pistons, 60 over. They are, about $100 for a set of pistons, which is totally doable. There's nothing trick about them. A set of cast rings, and we'll get those pressed on the rods, and we'll build a motor with a flat top 289 piston, and I will shift gears, and I'll use a set of stock 289 cylinder heads instead of the 351. What that does is it kind of changes the parts that I have in inventory and what I use. I now have a set of 351 Windsor heads that are completely built, and we'll tag them and bag them, and we'll save them for something down the road. The 302 heads, or 289 heads that I had in inventory, really weren't for anything other than I'd magged the heads and everything was good, and I wanted to get all the pieces back together before things got separated, and I was having to hunt up parts. So, change direction a little bit. That's kind of the plan. Not a huge bomb, but we will spend a couple $100 more on the motor than I had envisioned, which sometimes happens. I'll still be into the motor for, probably under $400, and I'm fine with that, to have a fresh. It'll be pretty much all fresh now, 289, ready to go for something, and that's the story. So we'll bring this video to a close. When I get the pistons and rods back, we'll pick it up with the assembly of putting the last pieces on the motor, and that should wrap up this series. Thanks for following along. If you like these kind of technical videos, please like, share, subscribe, even leave a comment if you like, and we can do more of them. Kind of fun to keep these things rolling, and we'll see you on the next project.